Hey everybody, how's it going? This is Eden May Bond. We've got a full moon coming up in the sign of Capricorn. And so today I want to take a look at that chart and see how that is going to sort of play out, what aspects are affecting this full moon. And also, I think it's important that we can think of a full moon in basically having three different types of ways that it can express itself. So that's why the title of this video is called The Three Things That Could Happen During a Full Moon. So the first thing that can happen during a full moon is that you're seeing the opposition between the sun and the moon being completely opposite to each other. And oppositions often represent an energy that is like a tug of war. So one thing that can happen during a full moon is that you can find yourself maybe either bouncing back and forth between different polarities, different sides of view, different points of view. So you can end up, the first example is sort of taking the stance that is represented by the sun's position. The second way that you can express a full moon energy can also be the full moon side, and that's almost probably the more dominant side in most cases because the full moon is really full of energy. So a lot of times you can take the position represented by the moon in whatever sign or location it's in. So you can sort of take these juxtapositions against each other. And sometimes those positions can be manifest in the world around us. So we might run into somebody that is representing one side of that opposition, and then maybe we take the other opposite end of it. So those are the two things that can happen during a full moon. The third thing, and really this is probably the best optimal case, is that there can be an integration between both the moon and the sun energies coming together. It's almost as if we try to resolve that tension somehow and we try to integrate it. And this is what I would say is something like the fully bloomed expression of the full moon. So you sort of integrate both sides and the tension is resolved and there's a blossoming of maturity that happens. So I think that's an interesting way to look at the full moon. I'm also going to, let's just pull up the chart here. And now this is set for June 13th at, well, in Hawaii, my time, it's going to be 8:37 in the morning. So that's going to be Pacific Island time, which is probably about 5 hours from East Coast American time. But all right, so we've got the full moon, the exact moment here, and we can see there's some interesting alignments happening. We've got the moon somewhat close to Pluto here. The moon is at 21 degrees here, 21 minutes you can see, and Pluto is at 27 degrees and 30 minutes. So it's not typically in Hellenistic astrology, we want to see the range of separation being within 3 degrees, but because the moon had a different status because the moon was a light, and also the moon was seen to sort of travel about 12, 13, 15 degrees a day, somewhere in there. And so they widened the moon's range of influence to that 15-degree range, or between like 12 and 15, I guess it's spoken about. But so that's because within the next 24 hours, past the exact opposition of the moon to the sun, the exact full moon moment, the moon will be making that adherence with Pluto. And I think that that is symbolic of the energy of this full moon. So that is one thing that is really interesting aspect wise. The other thing that I think is actually incredibly fascinating, almost mind-blowingly so. I get excited about these things, but you can see that we've got the sun in Cancer at 21 degrees, 21 minutes. We've got Mercury at 17 degrees and 42 minutes. Now, Mercury will, let's actually get rid of the circles for a second, and let's actually go forward in time here by days. I'm going to move the clock forward by days, and I want to see when does Mercury make that Kazemi moment. So it looks like it's going to be July 16th. So just 3 days after the full moon, Mercury, you can see here, I'll get my little circle back going. Mercury actually moves on to the same degree as the sun. I once heard somebody talk about degrees as like steps. So it's like whenever a planet moves on to the same degree, it's like they're both on the same step, but each degree is its own thing. It's its own step. So once Mercury and the sun move on to the same step or the same degree, Mercury is said to be in the heart of the sun, or cazimi. I'm going to come back to that just in a second, but let me go back to the actual full moon time here. Okay, so there we are at the full moon time again. Now, what is fascinating is that let's just think about the opposition that is happening between the two lights. One of the lights, the moon, is getting close to a planet that has some symbolic tie-in with things of like a death or afterlife, or these very outer cosmo kind of primal life and death kind of things, and that would be Pluto, right? That's Pluto represents these very, very primal things that have a connection to the afterlife, or like mediumship, people that can communicate with ghosts and spirits and stuff like that. That is Pluto. What is also happening is that on the other side, the flip side, in Cancer, we have Mercury, who is essentially a god that is said to be able to go into Hades, into the underworld, to see Pluto in the mythology. So that is just mind-blowing. The mythology and the symbolism and the actual astronomy of the moment is incredibly synchronized. So you've got Mercury going into the underworld, visiting the sun. Now, why is Mercury going into the underworld? You might be thinking, well, I don't understand why Mercury is going into the underworld. Well, what happens in Hellenistic techniques or astrology is that whenever a planet was getting really close to the sun, it was that planet was no longer visible in the sky. So the light of the sun, it's just too bright. And so the light of the sun is going to overcome any light that you can see from Mercury. And we can see Mercury as a decently small but bright point of light in the sky, either in the early morning or in the beginning of the evening. Mercury never gets that far away from the sun, so a lot of times you don't see Mercury. But the ancients, you can imagine, they're out there in the Mesopotamian area or Egypt. It's dry. They have clear visibility on a lot of nights. So they're watching the planets in the ancient world. They're being able to see these planets. And they've noticed that when a planet gets within a certain range of the sun, you can no longer see the planet because the sun's light is just too bright. That was a symbolic representation to them that the planet was entering the underworld, like it was going through a death as its own light was basically being swallowed up. Now, as Mercury crosses over the sun and then begins to go forward ahead of the sun in zodiacal order, at some point again, Mercury will be reborn, or the Mercury's little point of light that will be visible again in the sky. So this whole thing was just representative or symbolic of Mercury going through a death, a rebirth kind of moment. So we're seeing Mercury things go through this death and rebirth moment. Now, there's one caveat is Mercury does this. Mercury goes around the sun. Mercury will go through this death and rebirth moment going forward. And Mercury will also do this going while it's going in its retrograde motion going backwards, right? So that's really, really interesting. What's the difference between a retrograde, a death and rebirth, versus a direct Mercury death and rebirth? I think that when Mercury is going backwards, I think that Mercury has surrendered its willpower to the primary motion of the planet. The fates have taken over. Mercury no longer cuts against the grain and moves ahead in the zodiac. Mercury is being pulled back, and that represents Mercury being at a loss of its own willpower. So it's being drugged down into the underworld, not of its own wishes or accord or willpower. It's just there's something fated that brings Mercury down into the underworld and then causes it to be reborn. What's interesting, though, going forward, Mercury is going against the grain of the primary motion of the sky, and hence could be seen to be still having its own willpower. So Mercury having its own willpower willingly goes into the underworld to be reborn and go out. Now, the only mythology that to me fits this kind of occurrence for me really is just the mythology of Icarus. So if you're familiar with the mythology of Icarus, Icarus essentially his father and Icarus, they need to escape the labyrinth, and they build him and his father build wings, and his father warns him, look, we're gonna fly out of this thing like birds, but don't fly too high to the sun, because the wax that's holding the feathers to the frame we build is going to melt, and then you'll fall and die. And he also warns him, don't fly too low, because the moisture will get up there. But essentially, people interpret this mythology as having something to do with Icarus either being too young and not listening well enough to his father, or being naive, or maybe being too cocky and sure about himself, and he ignores this or forgets this, and he flies too close to the sun. The sun melts the wax, and essentially he falls. So he does it of his own accord. So I'm thinking that a direct Mercury moving into that realm of Hades, into the underworld of its own power, is sort of a little bit like Icarus. Maybe there's something we're unaware of. Maybe there is something that we've been told, but we're just not heeding it. Maybe there's something like that. There's some reason why we might bring about our own sort of death and rebirth in terms of mercurial things. Mercury in Cancer, I guess, could be conversations that you get too emotional in, or conversations that you're overly sensitive and you're not quite as rational, or something like this. So you could just be really emotional. The emotions could be swallowing up the rationality on some level. Or you just could be just kind of like a sentimental fool, like almost. Anyway, there could be something in this full moon where you sort of crash and burn sentimentally, or something like this. You get too emotional and say the wrong thing, something like that. And we also see the moon again going into a closer range with Pluto right after the full moon. So that is really, really interesting. We have definitely a signification of the underworld. We've got the god of the underworld, Pluto, who is also called Hades, and we've got Mercury entering the underworld as he gets closer to the sun. So that is really the dynamic of this full moon. There aren't a lot of other aspects that are really connecting to the sun and the moon. Normally what we do is we say, is there anything that's making an aspect to either of the luminaries, and that will tie into it. Like, for instance, the full moon, we had that Jupiter square that was that Jupiter aspect that was making that superior square to the sun. And that was really, really heavy, actually. But in this case, it's really just these two planets that are close to the sun and the moon that are really giving us the symbolic idea about what this moon could entail. So I also want to get into 5 things or 5 keywords, or some kind of ideas about what this energy could represent. And these are just taken from Cancer and Capricorn. So again, we've got the 3 ways that a full moon can express itself. You can either sort of find yourself defending the side of the sun, you can find yourself defending the side of the moon, or there could be some integration between both of those sides. So the first keyword that I would pair together, keywords coming from Cancer and Capricorn, the first one would be sentimental stoicism. We've got the sentimentality of Cancer. We've got the stoicism of Capricorn. They're a bit opposites on one level, because stoicism is all about not getting too excited when things are really great, kind of staying a little bit level-headed, and not getting too down when things are not going so well. So stoicism is a little bit opposite of the emotional nature of Cancer, especially that Cancer is the exaltation home of Jupiter, who likes to do big things and really, really go extravagant. So on one level, you can see that they're opposites, but if you integrate those two things together, you could get a sentimental stoicism. You could get somebody that you can kind of tell they have a lot of sentimental emotions happening, but they're going to try to keep that under control, or sort of keep that regulated, not get too one way or another. So there's a sense of maybe this full moon, us feeling a lot of emotions, but trying not to get too excited or too low. So that's the first thing that I could see this full moon kind of expressing. The second one, spiritual ins and outs. What does that mean? Well, spiritual ins, simply, Cancer was the sign where the sun makes a turn and begins to descend back down from its highest declination in the sky the whole year long and comes back down into earth. So the ancients called it the entrance of spirit into matter, or I think you could call it for instance, the return of spirit coming down into matter. So that's spiritual ins. On the flip side, Capricorn represents the moment of the year where the sun is at its lowest declination in the sky and will begin to ascend away from the earth. And so the ancients likewise called this sign a sign that was represented for the gateway of the gods, or spirit exiting matter, or the return of spirit leaving matter once again. So these are just ebbs and flows, right? But so you could have spiritual ins and spiritual outs. So this could be somebody that is fluctuating back and forth. You could feel some way about one day you're feeling incredibly spiritual, but then you're wrestling with, but I still have to do things out in the world. I still have to maintain some practicality and pragmatism. This could be a little bit of where you're kind of fluctuating back and forth. Or if you're integrating this could be something where you're able to balance both of those things. You're able to bring back in the spirituality of the moment, and also have some pragmatism and get the mundane chores or requirements, obligations met at the same time. And you're finding a balance between those two things. So I think that is the second thing that this moon could express itself as. The third thing is, it could be disciplined nurturing. This time I'm going for discipline coming from the more Capricorn side of things, and nurturing obviously coming from the Cancer side of things. But you put those two things together and it almost reminds me of that old saying. I grew up with it. It was called tough love. So you get somebody that wants to nurture, or you might get parents that are being very nurturing, but they're not just going to nurture you, frivolously. There's going to be some obligation of maintaining a discipline or orderliness or control of behavior and something like that. So it's not going to come free. It's going to be a nurturing, but there's going to be obligations attached to the nurturing. There's going to be requirements for the nurturing. So it reminds me of that old saying, tough love. Number 4, emotional control. This is a bit like a lot of these so far. We just have the emotionality of Cancer, and we have the controlling sort of quality of Capricorn, where you just want to sort of suppress or curtail, or maybe not even like aggressively, but there's some sense of where you might feel like something's bubbling up, and there's also some need to sort of like play it cool, like that, like don't give your hand away, something like that. So that's number 4. And again, you could see either one of these playing out. So let's say, for instance, like an example of this, let's say that you're somewhere and you're talking with someone, and like they're being really stifling, and you just feel like it's like, man, you just got to you have some big emotions that you're going through, and you just got to express them, and you almost burst out, and that's where you can see kind of the opposition, where you're taking the side of the sun, for instance. Or it may be that you're the other person and you're being met with somebody that's just bubbling over, and you feel the need to sort of take the side of the moon and be like, hey, yeah, okay, you're being, very, very emotional. And do we need all of this emotion? Sort of that sort of side. So you can sort of take all of these and pair them off like that. And the fifth one is spiritual maturity. This one is kind of like the second one, the spiritual ins and outs. Spiritual maturity, this is just where we're able to really integrate a discipline for spirituality. So this is when we somehow find some kind of balance, and it might take a little bit of back and forth. There might be some tension there. We might have to work something out or figure something out on this full moon. But I think if you're falling into sort of this zone of spiritual maturity, it's as if the full moon represents something that is maturing, that is culminative, that is flowering, that is blooming or ripening. And that ripening could represent taking both of these things, taking the maturity of Capricorn and the spiritual, inward spiritual nature of Cancer, and those two things coming together and finding yourself on maybe a level up of ability to practice some spirituality. So I would watch for that, because I think that that is a very real possibility for this full moon. So it is a pretty, it's a pretty cool full moon that's coming up. There could be a lot of emotions. There could be some things that are trying to hold back or be stoic or control. And there's a lot of power because, again, we've got Mercury going into the underworld, and we have the moon moving by Pluto shortly after. And then 3 days after the full moon, we have Mercury being on that Cazimi moment. So this is a full moon where there could be something happening that brings you to that rendering or that alchemical revelatory moment that is happening 3 days later as Mercury enters the heart of the sun. So that's what I'm seeing for this full moon, guys. So I hope it's a really good one for you. Please let me know how it goes in the comment section below, and please like and subscribe, and I will catch you next time. Thanks so much.